Do it. All right. Welcome back to Kevin's Security Weekly.
No, it's not Kevin's Security Weekly. No one wants that. No one wants to watch that.
No, that's true. I would watch it. It'd be amazing.
It's just me being angry and writing Python scripts.
Welcome to CIS Critical Control numero dos.
Zwei.
Software asset inventory. And, I think in the intro, I brought up that you and I don't necessarily agree on all points because my initial feedback was I kind of want to combine this into just generic asset inventory because from my perspective, it is important to know what software assets are on your hardware assets or what may only be software, maybe like serverless computing and functions and things that you may run in cloud instances. I do think those are important, but I also consider like an asset is an asset is an asset. And, if you start focusing on hardware versus just software versus what might just be code, it kind of seems like it's all the same thing to me. And so I told Kevin, I want to combine all this together. And you said, Bonner, you're dumb. Please don't do that. Let's keep them separate controls. People way smarter than us broke them out for a reason.
That's way smarter than you, to be fair.
That's true. That is accurate. That is accurate.
We definitely had a bit of a debate about this. And for me, I'm a big believer that hardware or what I would sort of consider infrastructure type assets are different than software assets. And I would say that Lambda or like serverless computes, I think, a really great contention point on this because, from that perspective, you have, let's say, a Python script that's running on AWS Lambda, and that there's not a server, it's not a Docker from your perspective. Like it's just this code that spins up, and maybe you have an event bridge that's tied to it, or you have an API gateway call that invokes the Lambda. For me, that's still like low-level infrastructure. And given that there is no server personally, I would consider that more part of like an SDLC type process compared to like asset enumeration. But if we're looking at like, I have a server and it's sitting in a rack. Like that's a little bit what we talked about on the first episode. And it's like exposing these services or whatever. But now as we move on to this episode, I think software assets around host environments are huge.
Sure.
And so that's why I wanted to break it out. And we'll talk about like long tail analysis, and I'll give some ideas on how I would like track down stuff like this in like corporate environments. But yeah, man, what are your thoughts on this?
It's really tough because I identify that it's critical control. Every environment, every security person should know what software and the versioning and the types are running in their environment. But I'm also conflicted because I also feel like this is something that's a little bit further down the maturity line. Like if we're talking to somebody who maybe doesn't even have hardware asset inventory, getting into that software side is a little bit more challenging, a little bit more maybe invasive might be the right word, because you do have to get into a machine or at least have credentials to do like a WinRM scan for a Windows box remotely. Or, there's challenges there, and it kind of feels like it needs to be further down the chain, but I also recognize that importance wise, it's huge.
Yeah, I would say I completely agree with the idea that like, from a maturity perspective, it's definitely not the first thing that you're going to do. You brought up WinRM is a great example. This is a really great use case for PowerShell GIA as well. If you have GIA running on your network, if you have like a Mac or Linux environment predominantly, even things like Paramiko can be tremendously useful. Sure. Things like Ansible that you can gather facts about your infrastructure can be really helpful. That sort of does blend, number one and number two. That's why these things aren't fully decoupled. But, for me, when I'm looking at trying to secure an environment, let's say I have an older version of Excel that doesn't have like external content protection, but like my Windows 11 or whatever is fully updated, but I have an old version of, Excel running on it. That's sort of a different like use case almost. And
Yeah.
so I think having those things separately is useful, because I think that data becomes useful in different types of scenarios. But I think having both is critical. And I would say it is a strong level of like higher maturity. But if you're just looking to write some PowerShell scripts or some Python scripts, it's not that complicated. Like, and one thing when I come to a lot of the solutions I recommend is like, don't ever look for perfection, right? You're never going to get one for one exactly the right thing if you're writing your own software or even buying software from other people. But it's like, hey, if you can implement Paramiko and you can run some search commands on all of your Mac devices on your environment, which does involve you having like SSH available, that still gets you in the running. So yeah.
Man, it's so crazy to hear somebody be like, yeah, it's not that hard to do. Because every time I've tried to do it, it's always been not a nightmare, but a challenge.
Yeah. So like, it's all about like getting around a network and figuring out what devices you can talk to and what you can't, because network segmentation is incredibly helpful. I think it's actually a really important thing to do.
Oh yeah.
But it is something to be aware of, that as you're like trying to get an idea of what assets are on your network, that like, if you don't allow east-west communication, then it's going to be really hard to figure out like what is running on what. Then you have solutions like Tanium, which is a paid solution, right? That like is sort of like a non-centralized point or a peer-to-peer, like again, decentralized botnet.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually pretty easy to figure out like what is running on your network. Just don't let hackers get into your Tanium environment. That's my suggestion there.
Yeah, that feels bad.
It is quite bad.
Yeah, I can imagine. And from kind of the product recommendation space, or at least how I've approached it in the past, in the SMB market, I've looked at OSQuery, where it's an open source solution. It does have some level of centralization. I can ask questions to my network. I can do software inventory. But before you can even get to that point, what I've experienced is the challenge of getting software distributed to the endpoints. There are ways to do it through GPO. There are ways to do it through SCCM or WSUS in a legacy Windows environment. One little, secret that I'll throw out from the incident response world is we typically have to deploy EDR solutions to thousands of endpoints very quickly, especially in Windows environments, or particularly in Windows environments. One solution we use is PDQ deploy. Free solution, highly recommend it. You put it on a machine that's domain joined. You give it credentials, admin credentials, because it can need to actually like log in and run. But it enables you to push software out to thousands of devices. It's 80 integrated. You can go in to say, hey, deploy to these machines. And one of the really nice facets of that particular software solution is the feedback mechanism, where, if I try and go out and script the install of OSQuery, if my script fails, I may not know, because creating that feedback loop isn't always the easiest thing to do. But PDQ deploy will tell you, hey, I tried to run this file. It ran successfully or exited successfully. Or alternatively, if I don't have permissions, or I couldn't run the file, or couldn't access these folders, or something's missing, it gives you that feedback and says, hey, unable to deploy the solution, try again later.
If PDQ uses like C script or W script to do that, or do you know what's running under the hood?
I don't know. I really should know, considering how much I use it. But no, I don't know. And unfortunately, when you start going down that path, it's a great tool for Windows environments. I don't have an equivalent tool for Mac or for Linux.
Yeah.
And when we start getting into, at least for me, in incident response scenarios, the Windows environment becomes really easy. The Linux environment becomes substantially more difficult. And when you go to customers and typically say, hey, how do you deploy solutions in your Linux environment? And they say, we don't. And it's like, yes, so this is how the breach started. Okay, go on.
It's so funny, because I feel the exact opposite. For me, when I think about like with how I approach DevOps and DevSecOps, like for me, it's like all Ansible, Puppet, Chef, like show me your playbooks, right? Like, how do you do this? Like if you have a auto load balancing group that auto spins up compute, like what are your setup scripts? And then with those things, for me, it's just like a matter of SSH. And then if I have SSH to a box, I can get whatever I want, right? Because everything on Linux is a file. And so it is interesting, man. I really like this different approach to this because for me, when I think about like a Windows environment, I'm comfortable with PowerShell and using WinRM and being able to like enumerate over SMB over a network. But like, yeah, I would much rather have to do forensics over a big Mac environment than in a Windows environment.
Wow. See, total opposite. Total opposite.
Yeah.
Like to me, when we get to the Mac and Linux portions, that's when we start becoming very manual, where like I can run Cape or I can run tooling, or even just through my EDR solution, I can run it across a bunch of hosts in the Windows environment. Works great. But as soon as I start getting into that, Linux, FreeBSD, all that kind of stuff, it's more manual just because a lot of these environments don't tend to have any automation, any playbooks in place. They spin it up because, hey, I had to have this Linux server to run this software that the business wants to use.
Yeah.
And we never set any, management framework around it in any process.
You want to know the secret weapon when it comes to that?
Yeah.
The bash history file. or Zish, if that's what you use, which is what I use. So just look to see what has been installed there, right? Because unless someone's really intentionally trying to obfuscate or otherwise damage or hide what's being written to bash history, it's hugely helpful. And actually, I was deprovisioning a server that you set up for one of my little side companies recently, and I was just capturing artifacts, and I grabbed the history file, and it was 995 lines or whatever. It was almost 1,000. And so I could see exactly what you added, what you installed. And from that, I was able to go grab the config files that we needed. And like, I know you're smiling, but it's true, right? The bash history file is hugely important.
No. It's just, it's unfortunate that you got to see all my trial and error failings.
It was just like 300 commands over and over again that were all wrong. That was a little surprising to me, but yeah.
Linux needs more tab completion.
That's true. And you kept trying to run IP config. And I'm like, come on, Mike, you're almost there. But anyway.
Eddie's only a little serious.
Yeah, to be fair, you're setting up a Tor server, nothing illicit, but I actually had to troubleshoot that box recently because there was an upgrade on Tor versions, and it was non-trivial, but it was great being able to go back and look at the history file and see like what was installed. So one of the things I've historically done is I was working with a PhD student from ASU, and we had to set up a bunch of phishing sites just for testing that we weren't actually phishing people.
Right. We'll go with that story.
Yes, exactly. And he was like, oh, like I need 40 boxes set up just like this one. He's like, do you need me to do anything? I was like, just give me SSH access. And I looked at the history file and I built an Ansible playbook off everything that he had done before, looking at like the things he installed. Did he grab them from GitHub and compile them himself? Did he use apt, those sort of things? Yeah. And then I was able to, again, pull that down, put it in an Ansible file, and I generated a whole infrastructure based on that. And it was super smooth. It was cool as heck.
Yeah. Heck yeah, man.
Yeah. I could talk, I just love automation when it comes to these things. So I could talk about it for hours.
Oh, I know. I do know. I do know that every time we had a vendor come in and had a conversation, your first question was, does it have an API?
Yeah. I mean, and that's true. I mean, I think like if you're an IC or a low level manager who's like looking at, how do you do this stuff by yourself, right? Because like if you're installing like asset management stuff, like the pricing, I don't totally know, but I imagine it can get quite expensive because everything in InfoSec feels like it's ridiculously expensive.
Yep.
I have a rule of thumb that everything in InfoSec, from a single threat list to like the most managed SIM or whatever, is like $225,000 a year. It feels like. But yeah, like knowing, just about WinRM and PowerShell GIA, which is just-in-time admin, which gives you like admin privileges, but it's a way to like lock that down, which is really cool. Or if you have a mixed environment, like knowing about Paramiko and all that is just, it's hugely beneficial. And even if it doesn't get you 100% of the way, like at least you can get closer, right, to knowing what's installed in your network.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes back to the control that we're talking about, we're looking at software that's installed and the versioning. One of the challenges, I guess not challenges, but one of the things that I run into in discovering client environments and understanding what's there is that now everything is on 443. Right. Yep. So now you need to understand what the software package is that it's actually responding. Is it, Apache? Is it Tomcat? Is it custom libraries? Is it, something crazy that Citrix came up with? Not that it's bad, but, Citrix has its own libraries. And so we need to have that software stuff in place to understand what's in the environment, the versioning, so that when there's a vulnerability, we can address it, which is going into the vulnerability management program. But on top of that, just to understand how your stuff is working. Sometimes it's not always apparent that, hey, I'm running this application and it sits on top of Apache, or it sits on top of Tomcat, or it's just, so just understanding your environment, understanding the software that you've got there. Critically important.
Yeah, I would say actually on top of that, from an incident responder point of view, let's say I have a network of 100 nodes, right? Which I know is small, but let's just go with that because it's a nice round number. And I run WinRM, and I do like a get sim instance, which is a PowerShell command. It's replacing WMI. And I have 100 endpoints, and 99 of them have Chrome installed, and 98 of them have Edge installed or whatever. And then 2 of them have magic recipe website.exe, right? Like, that's interesting. And so this is what we're talking about when it comes to long tail analysis, is not looking at what's common in your environment, but what's rare. And I know that this is a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about, but let's say you did the exact same thing and you did like, let's say you had a Linux server and you're like, all right, I'm going to use RPC client to enumerate a Windows environment, and I have, active credentials, and I log on to 100 boxes and I do like a get users or get local groups or whatever I want to do. And then on 2 boxes, there's like a Met SVC admin account, right? That's real bad. And a lot of people don't know to look for that. So having an ability to query the software level, and that maybe even includes accounts and groups and things that are provisioned, I think is hugely important in a network.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%, especially because there's mechanisms of persistence that are not software based, but maybe account based or application based file, having persistence, a subscription set in WMI, things like that, and being able to query and ask across your network and identify those anomalies. Incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And, again, we're sort of, as we will more and more as we go down these controls, like sort of strolling off the path here. But, attackers, they don't always care about like cred and being the most elite, right? For the most part, attackers are going to get into your network however they can.
Yeah.
If that's a leaked credential, that's what they're going to do. If it's phishing, that's what they're going to do. But as soon as they get on your network, they're going to try to get like legitimate, quote unquote, access. And oftentimes that legitimate access is either a compromised user account or an account they gave themselves.
Yeah.
That has admin across the network. So being able to query just the accounts on your network is huge. One thing to also keep in mind on top of just software assets is knowing like what I would say cron jobs are, but like scheduled tasks and services running on your boxes. People sleep on AESPs, which is the auto run extensibility start points or whatever. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but knowing in your registry, like what is going to start up when I reboot this machine, right? Understanding the difference between HKLM and HKCU, which is Hive key local machine versus Hive key current user, and the difference between a particular user logging in and a box booting up, and when that happens, and the difference between W script and C script, and the implications of being able to see that. Like, again, I know I'm actually probably making it sound way more complicated than we intend it to, but having an idea of what those things are is important. And there are ways, there's a ton of different ways to automate detecting, especially in Windows, because Windows PowerShell is actually amazing, in my opinion. You are muted, Mr. Bonner.
I apologize. I had some background noise on my end. Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. All right. No, I mean, PowerShell is amazing for attackers and administrators. I mean, mostly attackers, but some for administrators. No, I love running PowerShell in environments. It makes life so much easier for a lot of the functions that you need to do day to day to just understand what's going on. And we use it all the time in incident response, just kind of being able to do automated tasks, bulk automated tasks, pull deep information from every endpoint.
Yeah.
No, it's fantastic. And
There's sorry to interrupt, but
go
there's a
ahead.
tool, and it's a little bit out of date, I believe, but it's worth looking at for inspiration, called Consa. And Consa will do things like long tail analysis and is able to, it's WinRM PowerShell based tool
Oh, cool.
that can find like weird accounts, weird users and stuff on your network. So that can help you, right? And maybe you need to tinker with it and update it or whatever to still be appropriate. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of like PowerShell that is available.
So I actually have a stupid question, primarily because I haven't heard that application before. How do you spell it?
Kansa.
Okay,
That's Kilo Alpha November Sierra Alpha, Consa.
cool. I'll have to check that out because
Yeah.
I mean, I've done stuff like, Deep Blue CLI or some other applications that can do some of that analytics for those accounts across, and that's just not one I've run into.
Yeah,
That's what I love.
Deep Blue is great when you have access to the event file. I love Deep Blue. I actually talk about Deep Blue in 504.
Nice.
Sec 504. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, I teach Sec 504 for SANS. And for me, like Deep Blue CLI is really great when I'm doing like forensics in a responsive sort of way, but Consa I think is really good for what we might refer to as threat hunting.
Nice.
And there's another tool, and I have not used this myself, but I've heard a lot of people who really like it, and it's called Velociraptor. It's from a company called Velocidex, and it used to be GUR, which was the Google Rapid Response, and the dude who made that went and started Velocidex. So that's another like asset management tool that does like sort of stride the line between like CIS Control 1 and 2, so it's kind of a 1.5 control.
Yeah.
And you can combine these, right, to what Mike was talking about at the very beginning of this. But I think it is good to think like, okay, I need to know what assets I have, but also like that's good from a vulnerability point of view, but not really. Actually, the software, in my opinion, is much more important. So.
And it's tough because I've used Velociraptor in the past. They got bought by somebody recently. I want to say Rapid7, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, I mean, I think of that. I wouldn't call it an EDR solution because it's not really.
It's not EDR.
Yeah, it's not EDR.
It's not, you wouldn't think of it like a Carbon Black. Yeah.
Yeah, but you do kind of think of it as something that's there, similar to an OSQuery, where like, hey, I can go and ask my network, what's up? Like, what kind of software do you have installed? What kind of things are running? You can ask questions to your infrastructure. Really love their solution. I do a lot of that with EDR solutions, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Cybereason, all those kind of tools that allow you to ask things of your assets. But yeah, then you start reaching into a slightly different control where it's like now it's endpoint protection or endpoint detection and response. But there is, again, a heavy overlap between controls.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this goes back to like, I'm stealing this analogy. So I just want to own that, let's think about a submarine, right? And you have $100 million to engineer a submarine, and you can spend that $100 million on like detecting problems, fixing problems, and alerting people as soon as there is a problem. And maybe that's what it looks like to have an EDR or some of these solutions to be able to iterate through your network. Or you can spend $100 million on the best forensics ever, right? And you have all this like forensics collection utilities, and you can tell what happened, right? And so if you're about to get on that submarine, do you want to get on the submarine that has all of the like protections built in? Or do you want to get on the submarine that's going to record your last moments of absolute terror and agony and minute detail, right?
Boy,
so for me,
what a tough choice.
I know. And I think it was Jason Fossen that I stole that from. He's the course author for Sec 505, which is a Windows class. And so sorry, Jason, if you ever see this for some reason and I butchered your analogy, but I think it is a good, way to think about it, right? Like especially with the control of assets and software, like we've talked about in the last couple episodes, like these things are going to maybe even feel like a waste of money until they absolutely don't.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And when we get to some of those controls, I'll have some fantastic stories to share with folks.
Absolutely. Well, man, I think we kind of beat the horse dead on this one.
Absolutely. Important, maybe for more mature organizations. I'm sticking by my story.
Yeah. Well, if you have questions, you can hit us up on social media. I am Kevin Tyers. You can track me down. I'm sure it's not that hard. But War on Shrugs on Twitter, Digonis on GitHub, if you want to see some of the stuff that I've written. That's pretty much the best way to get a hold of me. And what about you, Mike? How do they reach out to you?
Mike Bonner with Bonner Security. Best way to reach me is LinkedIn. Always happy to respond back out to folks who are interested and help out in any way I can. Again, no other social media for me.
All right. Sounds good. All right. See you next week.
Thanks, Kevin. See you next week.
Bye.
Later.